In my last video, I talked about the 6 quarterbacks of the 2024 NFL Draft. This was a milestone and super exciting, don't get me wrong. I mean, I'm so excited I made a whole ass video about it, despite the fact that these guys haven't even played in a preseason game yet. But there's one other time in NFL history that 6 quarterbacks went in the first round, and that year was 1983.
United States begins with Amici and the ball game is over. Alan Amici has scored the touchdown and the Baltimore Colts are the professional football champions of the world. And his pass is broken up by Tatum. It's off.
Goes to the back of the end zone, and it is caught for a touchdown by Holmes.
Unbelievable.
Incredible. Second and goal. Pass. Got it.
To set the stage properly, I have to discuss the bonker year that was 1982. The year didn't even really start. I mean, seriously, that was the year of the player lockout. The players and the NFLPA were trying to implement a wage scale based on percentage gross of both the team and the NFL as a whole. This negotiation would last so long that the season was in jeopardy of not being played. Americans were so bored without the NFL that NBC and other TV networks were forced to play Division III NCAA games, or, get this, even CFL games. Yeah, it was a rough time for sports fans. Eventually, the players revolted against their own union, and play commenced on the new 9-game schedule. This all led to the playoffs expanding from the customary 10-team playoff to 16. That was over half the league back then, yet somehow the Bears still managed to miss them. Anywho, through all this chaos, how did the product on the field fare? Well, the MVP was a kicker who missed 3 extra points back when they were from the 1-yard line. So, I kid. Kind of. Some players absolutely did have a good year. Ken Anderson of the Cincinnati Bengals had a 70 completion percentage, which would be impressive in today's game, let alone back in the early 80s. He also had the highest passer rating in the league. Meanwhile, San Diego quarterback Dan Fouts led the league in yards with 2,883, which is 320 yards per game. That means if the year had been a normal length, he would have been the first 5,000-yard passer in NFL history. It wasn't just quarterbacks either. Freeman McNeil had 786 yards rushing for the Jets. Just don't mention his 7 fumbles. Fouts' top weapon, Wes Chandler, even surpassed 1,000 yards receiving, and he did that in only 8 games. Yet the kicker won MVP somehow. But enough about 1982. Let's talk about the next year's draft. Teams that missed the expanded playoffs were absolutely humiliated, and rightfully so. It is still the only time in NFL history that has happened. And to be so bad that you miss it, meanwhile the under 500 Lions made it? Yeah, that's bad. It was especially bad for Baltimore, though. The Colts were dreadful. They got thoroughly beat at home in week 1 by the Patriots. Then, admittedly, played the Dolphins pretty close in Miami the following week. That was the highlight of their year. After the strike, they laid back-to-back goose eggs. I guess someone forgot to tell them the season started again. Fast forward to week 15, or game 7, and the team was completely checked out. They were 0-6, just coming off of a 3-point loss to the Vikings. Not wanting to be the only team that would finish winless on the year, they really put up a fight against the Packers. Well, they didn't lose, per se. That game utterly broke them, as evidenced by being outscored 78-33 in the next 2 games to finish the year 0-8-1. Technically not a 0-win percentage. This draft also happened to have the Andrew Luck of his time, an all-time hyped-up quarterback prospect by the name of John Elway. Elway's career at Stanford was amazing. In his first full year as a starter, he led the Cardinals to a stunning 31-14 rout of the 4th-ranked Oklahoma Sooners. He would end his year with 2,889 yards and 27 touchdowns. His senior year, he would lead the NCAA with 24 passing touchdowns on top of his 3,242 passing yards, the 3rd best in all of the nation. While the Cardinals themselves never found too much success with Elway on the field, John himself did more than enough to secure the #1 overall pick. Just one problem: he would not play for the Colts. In what could be, or at least the most remembered refusal to play for a team before a certain someone in 2004, Elway said in no uncertain terms he would rather be caught dead than suiting up for the Baltimore NFL team. He went so far as to threatening to play in the MLB rather than play for Irsay's team. In response,
Baltimore selects quarterback John Elway of Stanford.
Yeah, they picked him anyway. Because fuck football, he's gonna be a Yankee instead. Just kidding. In actuality, the Colts were working on a trade with the team you all know he went to. Now, unless this video is gonna be 14 hours long, which it kind of is, I can't go super in-depth about everyone who was picked. But in Elway's case, I don't really think I need to. Elway was a fantastic quarterback and a Bronco legend, don't get me wrong. But for how much he was hyped up out of college, he didn't really have the gaudy numbers that you would expect. I mean, he was good, great even. You can't lead your team to 5 Super Bowls without at least being great. At the same time, though, he did lose those first 3. Quite badly, actually, and didn't win a Super Bowl until the Broncos became a super team in the late 90s. You can even argue he wasn't a top 3 quarterback in his own era. Maybe top 5, but certainly not the best. So part of me wants to say that maybe he didn't deserve all of that draft hype. The other part of me wants to slap myself for even thinking such a thing. John was one of the best comeback quarterbacks ever. He went to 5 Super Bowls, won 2, and had a definite top 10 arm of all time. He even owns one of the most iconic and memorable Super Bowl highlights ever. Overall, you can't really say you missed on a Hall of Famer, especially since he's still one of the best quarterbacks to ever wear the orange and blue. The next pick was owned by the Rams. All they did was pick one of the best running backs of all time. Then another solid back went the next pick to Seattle, that being Kurt Warner. No, Kurt Warner, the other one. Anyway, fast forward a bit. Chicago earned the 6th pick in the draft and selected Pittsburgh tackle Jimbo Covert. And of course he made the Hall of Fame. His first name was Jimbo. After that, the Chiefs were on the clock. The strike-shortened year was a tough one for the Chiefs. They split their first 2 games of the season before the strike started. Once play resumed, they bottomed out. 4 straight losses, the last of which was a narrow division loss against rival Los Angeles. No, the Raiders. But a weird thing happened after that loss. They sorta got hot? I mean, sure, they did lose in Week 16 against the 49ers, but they thoroughly beat both Denver and New York to end their year. In the win against the Broncos, Chiefs starter Bill Kenny was decent but not spectacular, as he was much of the year. In fact, he was so mid the Chiefs actually benched him for Steve Fuller, who started back in 1979 and 1980. Fuller didn't play great either, however, and the club ultimately went back to Kenny to end out the year. Not satisfied they had the future of their franchise on their roster, the Chiefs decided to join the Colts in selecting a quarterback. They chose Todd Blackledge. Blackledge was drafted from Penn State, being a 3-year starter for the program. The team itself was wildly successful with Todd under center, going 31-5 and even winning the Natty in 1982. By the way, that game was played against the Georgia Bulldogs, led primarily by back Herschel Walker, much like the Lions themselves, who ran through Kurt Warner. No, the other one! Todd that year was more of a game manager. He only had 2,000 yards through the air, but because all he did was win, and the fact that game managers were just more popular back then, he was still a first-round pick. Blackledge's rookie year in the NFL, he didn't start, although that was more the norm back then. He appeared in only 4 games, but was quite efficient, throwing for 259 yards and 3 scores. The only turnover he had in the year was a fumble. So, overall, a promising start, albeit he didn't play much. Entering year 2, the Chiefs and head coach John Malkovich made the call to start the young signal caller because of a preseason injury to Bill Kenny. How did he do? Well, the first 2 games of the Blackledge experience was very similar to Penn State Blackledge. 450 yards, 3 touchdowns, and 1 pick. Not bad. Then the wheels fell off. Over the next 5 games, Todd threw just 920 yards with 2 touchdowns and 7 picks. That's on top of a woeful 49 completion percentage. The last game he would start for the opening bit of the year was against the Chargers. Blackledge had 133 yards and yet another pick before the Chiefs finally had enough and put a now healthy Kenny back in. Quick sidebar, in week 10 that year, the Chiefs traveled to Seattle. Kenny, still being the starter, threw back-to-back pick sixes in the second quarter. One was returned for 90 yards, the other 76. Suffice it to say, the Chiefs had seen enough and put Todd back into the game. He didn't turn the tide any. If anything, he made it worse, throwing an additional 3 picks. Only one of which was a pick six, but still. So, by the fourth quarter, the Chiefs just said fuck it and chucked third-string quarterback Sandy Osleski into the game. With just 2 minutes left in the game, all Kansas City wanted to do was get out of Dodge. Instead,
Brown returned interceptions of 95 and 58 yards for touchdowns. In total, the Seahawk defense picked off 6 passes for a record 330 yards, scored 4 touchdowns, and shut out the Chiefs in a 45-0 win.
Yep, another pick six, 4 in one game. Stop throwing the ball! The rest of that season was a wash for Todd. He barely played after that disaster. The following year was somehow slightly worse for Todd. In 1985, he started 6 games and appeared in 12. His best game was against the Colts, in which he tossed 246 yards, 1 touchdown, and a pick. His worst game of the year came a few weeks before that one against the Rams. What happened in that game, I hear you ask? Oh, nothing. He just casually threw 6 interceptions. He would finish the year with 6 touchdowns to 14 picks. Somehow, after back-to-back terrible years, the Chiefs let him start more games in 1986, a career-high 8 games. Was he still awful? Yes. Was he as bad? No? That year he accumulated only 1,200 yards, tossing 10 touchdowns to only 6 picks. But hey, it's his first positive touchdown to interception ratio since his rookie year. He even played in a playoff game against the Jets, where he threw 80 yards and 2 picks. So, not great. That would pretty much end his career. He had one last chance to prove he could do something in the NFL, but instead he just couldn't muster up anything. 1987 would be his last year in Kansas City, only appearing in 3 games, mostly in mop-up or injury-related. At 27, he would sign with the Steelers as the team's backup. In his 2 years in the Steel City, he played in just 6 games, ending with 3 touchdowns and 6 picks. Even then, he couldn't shake his interception habit. Ultimately, Blackledge might just be one of the biggest draft busts that no one remembers. What makes that pick sting even worse for the Chiefs fans was that Hall of Fame guard Bruce Matthews was picked just 2 selections later to the Oilers. Fast forwarding a bit to pick 14, a selection owned by the Buffalo Bills. The Bills in 1982 started the year quite well, actually. By week 14, they were 4-2, just beating the once great Steelers 13-0. After that game, however, they kind of ran out of gas. Week 15 was a 1-point heartbreaking loss to the Bucs. At least it was still close. That's something you really can't say about their next game versus division rival Miami, getting trounced 27-10. All of a sudden, they were 4-4, desperately clinging to their once nailed-down playoff spot. The last game of the year was against the Patriots, who were also entering the game 4-4. So this game was essentially for a playoff spot. Bills' longtime quarterback of the time, Joe Ferguson, was up to the challenge. Mostly. Midway through the first half, the Bills were up 13-3 and seemed all but certain to make it into the dance. Unfortunately for Buffalo, they are cursed and can have no nice things. They would get outscored 27-6 the rest of the game as the offense stalled out. Looking at Joe's stat line, it doesn't look too bad, but his inability to get Buffalo over the hump was getting old. Sound familiar? He was the Bills' starter since he entered the league in 1973. They were up and down with him at the helm. It just felt like they had reached their ceiling with him. So in the 1983 draft, they would throw their hat into the quarterback sweepstakes. Their prize? Jim Kelly. This is a weird story. The Kelly we all know today is obviously a fantastic pick and a no-brain Hall of Famer. But if you had said that back in the day, I think you would have been shot. First of all, he was almost not even a quarterback. He was actually recruited to be a linebacker. He would turn down a scholarship from, oh, look, it's Penn State again, and instead sign in Florida with the Miami Hurricanes. Miami themselves would have a string of pretty solid seasons with Kelly, but Jim wasn't building a massive portfolio. His senior season, for example, he finished with just 585 yards. That's it. He played in every game. He only had 3 touchdowns all year. How was he a first-round pick? I don't know. I don't get it. What I do know is the NFL were not the only ones wanting a piece of that sweet Kelly pie. Jim wasn't super fond of the idea of playing in Buffalo. 1, because of the team not having that much overall success, and 2, it's cold. Buffalo is one of the coldest places to play in the NFL. And coming from a Florida college team, that didn't sound too appealing. What's his solution? Take his talents to the USFL. As unusual as that would be today, back then they actually pulled some massive quarterbacks away from the NFL. Jim Kelly, Super Bowl 22 MVP Doug Williams, and even future NFL MVP Steve Young all ended up in the USFL in 1984. Kelly decided not to sign with the Bills and opted to play for the Houston Gamblers, a way warmer city than Buffalo. In 1984, he would light up the skies in the league, passing for an absurd 5,219 yards and 44 touchdowns. He would follow that up in 1985 with 4,623 yards and 39 touchdowns. It's still a good year, albeit fellow USFL and NFL quarterback John Reeves was much closer in yardage total than anyone was to Kelly in the previous year. Unfortunately for the upstart league, the 1986 season would never come to pass. They lost an antitrust lawsuit against the NFL, and as such folded operations just day before the season was set to begin. A tough loss for fans, but not so much for Kelly. He had done more than enough to prove himself as a legitimate quarterback. The Bills still retained his rights from back when they drafted him, and this time Kelly signed on that dotted line to officially be welcomed into the NFL. His first foray into the league was not great for him or the Bills. He threw 3,593 yards, 24 touchdowns to 17 picks. Definitely some growing pains there. Meanwhile, the team was still irrelevant, winning just 4 games. Next year would be a slight improvement for the team, but Kelly himself still wasn't performing up to his own USFL standard. 1988 was a step backwards for Jim, barely getting 3,000 yards and posting his first negative touchdown to interception ratio. Luckily for Bills Mafia, the team itself saw massive improvement, going 12-4 and making it all the way to the AFC Championship game, where Kelly would throw 3 picks in an all-around embarrassing loss on the second biggest stage of all of the NFL. It was starting to feel like deja vu for Bills fans. The team was finally on an upswing again, but being held back by mediocre or bad quarterback play. Kelly would miss some time in 1989 with a separated shoulder, but would return for their wildcard game against the Browns. Jim played quite well overall, but his 2 mistakes would come back to bite them, as Browns quarterback Bernie Kosar would outplay the now 29-year-old Jim Kelly to advance. So it was time to move on, right? I mean, he was about to turn 30, and he had done nothing really more than being average to slightly below average in his time in the league. Not quite yet. The Bills had decided to run it back one more time, and Kelly was about to blossom. The next 4 years of Kelly's career were dominant. 13,000 plus yards, 98 touchdowns, and 4 straight Super Bowl appearances. Still to this day the only team to accomplish such an incredible feat. In 1990, he had the highest completion percentage in the league. In 1991, he led the league in touchdowns and was named an All-Pro. All of this is fantastic for Jim, but for the Bills, it must have been bliss. After so long of being walking mediocrity, they finally form a dynasty. So how come everyone talks about the 90s Cowboys instead of the Bills? Yeah, it's pretty much impossible to talk about Kelly's Bills without the historic heartbreak part. But I don't want to dwell on that here. Kelly was undoubtedly a massive hit in this draft, and the Bills owe any real success they ever had to him and his K-Gun offense. 1995 would be his last good season, as 1996 was a year to forget. But hey, give the man a break. He was nearly 40 at that point, and God knows he needs one. Back to the draft now, as New England was on the clock. 1982 was a 500 year for the club, as evidenced by their draft position being 15. The team won their final game of the regular season against Joe Ferguson's Bills and hence advanced to the expanded playoffs. They would get the pleasure of drawing division rival Miami, who had lost only 2 games that whole year. Good news, one of them was against New England, though. New England came up on top of a 3-0 clunker in Week 14. Miami's quarterback that game, David Woodley, had just 76 yards and 2 picks. Steve Grogan answered by only completing 3 passes all day, and only 2 of those found their way into Patriots' hands. But none of you know this game for that. No. You know it for this.
The little brush machine came out on the field here to make a place for John Smith to spot the ball. There you see it, that slash mark at the right of your screen.
Ah, yes, the famous snowplow game. What helped New England that game was an unfair home field advantage, maybe the most blatant of all time. The same thing would not help them out just 4 weeks later, as the rematch was in sunny South Florida. That means the Dolphins are unstoppable. In fact, that's still true. I already mentioned Pat starter Steve Grogan, who had been with the team since 1975. Up until that point, he was very mediocre, having 23 more interceptions than touchdowns, and averaging just 175 yards per contest. He did extend his starting window in 79 by leading the league in touchdowns, but much like the Bills, they were being held back by poor quarterback play. So,
New England's first choice in the first round, quarterback, Tony Eason, Illinois.
Eason was mostly a mop-up quarterback in his rookie year, although he did start 4 games. Those appearances were not super promising, leading to only 1 touchdown to 5 interceptions. The only game he didn't throw a pick in, he had just 10 passing attempts in the whole game. Only completed 3 of them in a 7-0 win against Saints. So heading into year 2, the team decided to stick with the veteran, at least until week 3. In the midst of a 23-0 embarrassment against the Seahawks, head coach Ron Meyer decided to see what the young gun could do. That decision would be rewarded with one of the most thrilling halves of football in Patriots history.
Eason takes a look, man is open, touchdown Patriots. Derek Ramsey in the end zone, and we've got the ball game early in the third quarter. Eason rolling out, he's got a lot of time, dumps it off, he's got a man. Lynn Dawson, a big tight end, fires a forearm into Simpson. We'll see as they go first and goal from the 2. Unbelievable. Touchdown, New England. You see John Hanna. Hanna blasted the defensive lineman from Seattle 5 yards back. Big play for the Seahawks. Blitz. Down goes David Craig at the 47-yard line. Tony Eason will hold. Snap and set down good. Kick is plenty long. It's good.
38 unanswered points. The moment that Grogan was pulled from that game, Eason established himself as the team's starting quarterback, and he had no intention to going back on the bench. In the best 14-game stretch of his career, he led the Pats to a 8-6 record, but with 3,228 yards, 23 touchdowns, and just 8 interceptions. A massive improvement on the 5 he threw in just 95 attempts the year prior. In fact, he actually led the league with the lowest interception rate in the league with 1.9. That means he was throwing a pick just under 2% of the time he was passing the ball. Compare that to the 5% in his rookie year. It's safe to say he learned how to not throw picks. He also had the 3rd best passer rating in the league, behind legend of the game, Joe Montana. Fortunately, all of this personal success didn't translate to team success, and the Pats would just missed out on playoff action. But New England felt confident about their future heading into 1985. Eason started the first 6 games of the year, winning 3 of them. But during a Week 6 game against the Bills, Eason just couldn't get anything going, and he threw 2 picks. So they inserted Grogan back into the lineup. This time around, it was Grogan's chance to play hero, and he did, ultimately winning the game. So, just like the previous year, they rode the hot hand in Grogan, until Week 12, where Grogan would suffer a broken leg against the Jets. So back into the game Eason went, who would finish out the year as the starter. The second half of the year was much better than the first 6 games for him, but it was still worse than his potential he showed last year. His magical season of not throwing interceptions was over, so back to throwing more picks than touchdowns for you, I guess. Throughout all of this quarterback nonsense, the team actually held their own, finishing the year 11-5. So, postseason success was next up on the agenda. The wildcard game was against New York, and it went quite well. Eason was efficient, didn't make any mistakes, and the team won. Okay, one playoff win. Better than Blackledge. How about the next round? Less efficient against the Raiders, but still no interceptions. Couple that with Craig James rumbling for 102 yards meant they had enough to survive Marcus Allen and the Raiders. So Championship Sunday it was. Who did they get the pleasure of facing? Only the damn Dolphins again, who had just went to the Super Bowl the year prior. Miami were 5.5 points favorite to win. So New England didn't really have a shot. Take that up with Eason. Okay, sure, he only had 71 yards, but he was super accurate. Only 2 incompletions that night, and, on top of that, 3 touchdowns, with the team rushing for 255 yards. Yeah, they upset the Dolphins that day. And just like that, even with Eason having under 400 passing yards all postseason, the Patriots still ran the table for the honor to appear in Super Bowl 20. That's all they did that day. Appear, be seen. Of course, we all know how the game went. It was 1985, and their opponent was the Bears. If you don't know what that means, you're not a football fan. A 46-10 smacking was in order for one of the most lopsided Super Bowls in NFL history. The game was equally scarring for Eason, who went 0-6 and got sacked 3 times before being pulled yet again as the Patriots fell behind 20-3. Later on, it was revealed that Eason contracted a viral infection just before the game and wasn't feeling that good on game day. That didn't really matter. This game ultimately kind of ended Eason's career. His own teammates started to turn after this pitiful showing in the Super Bowl. Hall of Fame guard John Hanna was quoted as saying, "Tony should wear a skirt instead of a uniform. When he was hurt before we played the Bears in the Super Bowl, we were hoping he'd stay hurt so Steve could play." When teammates are publicly talking smack about you, especially as the team's starting quarterback, you're done. He would start one more year with New England in 1986, en route to winning the division for the first time in nearly a decade. Unfortunately, they didn't have the same magical playoff run in them, and lost their opening tilt against John Elway and the Denver Broncos. 1987 was the other strike-shortened year, and it was even shorter for Eason as he missed week 1 with a groin injury. He only played 3 games that year. In 1988, the Patriots again sided with Grogan over Eason to start the year. Just make up your damn mind! Eason wouldn't even see game action until week 15, where he threw 2 picks, but it didn't matter, and the team won anyway. His final year in New England was wild. He started week 1 by having himself a decent, albeit not great game against the Jets, followed up by 2 not-so-good games against the Dolphins and Seahawks, the latter of which saw him being benched for 27-year-old Doug Flutie, who, by the way, also played in the USFL. Shortly after this, the Patriots cut their former first-round pick, when he refused to take a pay cut. He would ultimately sign with the Jets towards the end of the year, even starting 2 games for them, before ultimately retiring at the conclusion of the 1990 NFL season. Next up in the quarterback sweepstakes, the Jets. Yes, another AFC East team. I already did a whole video about the 1981 Jets, watch it if you'd like to see more, but in that video I said this.
Let's just say the 1982 team had just as many highs, but a much greater letdown than this season. But that's a story for another day.
Whereas 1981 ended with them in their first playoff game for quite a while, 1982 would get fans' hopes up even higher, running the gauntlet all the way to the AFC Championship game. They were still led by perpetual frustration quarterback Richard Todd. Again, watch the video for more in-depth analysis. 82 was his best year in the league, at least in terms of passer rating. They were also led by running back Freeman McNeil, who I mentioned like a half hour ago. God, this video is too long. Anyway, that championship game was marred by mud, so it earned the nickname the Mud Bowl. Who was the MVP of that game? A.J. Dewey, a name that still haunts Jets fans. At the conclusion of the year, the Jets were finally ready to rid themselves of Todd, and another perfectly fine quarterback prospect was ready to step up to the plate. Ken O'Brien had just led his collegiate alma mater, the UC Davis, to an undefeated season, including the championship game. Well, how the hell was he not the first quarterback taken? Well, UC Davis was a Division II program, meaning he didn't play against the big boys like Michigan or Georgia. Also, the talent level in Division II is obviously not quite up to the level the rest of these guys played around. So the Jets pick him at 24, they were essentially gambling that his lower level college success would translate to the NFL. Did it? Sort of? O'Brien did lead the Jets as their primary starter for 7 seasons, starting in 1985. He was solid, too, leading the league in both the lowest interception rate as well as the highest passer rating during what was essentially his rookie year. They also went 11-5 that year, making the playoffs. That was the game I talked about earlier against the Patriots, the one that Eason played his best postseason ball on their way to getting clobbered in the Super Bowl. Ken played alright, but he did throw a costly pick on their way to the loss. 1986 would be the defining highlight of his career. In week 3, they played against the Dolphins, and O'Brien would light up the sky, tossing 479 yards and 4 touchdowns in a thrilling 51-45 victory. Later on in the year, he would make history against Seattle, becoming the first quarterback to achieve a perfect passer rating while also throwing for over 400 yards. That game, a 38-7 victory. The team finished 10-6. But there was trouble afoot for Ken. He was suffering from a sore shoulder. That's hard to say. He was suffering from a sore shoulder down the stretch of the year, and by the time the playoff action came, Ken just couldn't be ready for the wild card. Luckily for the Jets, they were playing the Chiefs and Todd Blackledge. Backup quarterback Pat Ryan played more than good enough for them to earn the victory. So it was decision time for the Jets. Do you start Ryan again, or the barely healthy Ken O'Brien? They started Ryan, but in a cruel twist of fate, he would get knocked out of the contest. Ken came in, and all things considered, played commendably, but it wasn't enough, and the Browns outlasted the Jets in overtime. The next 4 years was a snowball of disaster for the Jets. Ken himself played all right, but not good enough to elevate the team around him, hitting rock bottom in 1989 when Ken guided them to just 4 wins in his 12 starts. 1990 was his first full 16-game season since 1985, but it was more of the same, and the team finished 6-10. O'Brien finished that year with only 13 touchdowns to 10 picks, and not even 3,000 yards. The team was starting to lose faith. But in 1991, Ken had 1 vintage season left in him. Okay, well, his stats were actually the worst of his career, but this time around, the team did enough to carry him to a playoff appearance. The first the club have had since that overtime loss to Cleveland. O'Brien rewarded the team by throwing 3 picks in a game that was otherwise quite close, leading to a 1-score loss to Warren Moon and the Houston Oilers. Despite making the Pro Bowl that year, somehow, the Jets were ready to move on. In his last year in the Big Apple, he played in just 3 games, throwing 6 interceptions to only 5 touchdowns, which was still somehow the best on the team that year. The following year would be his last, playing only 4 okay games in Philadelphia, even though the team lost all 4 tilts. And that would write the end to his football story. He was a decent quarterback, and still one of the best Jets quarterbacks ever, but I bet they wish they would have gotten the guy this class is most known for. The one I've been dancing around all video. That Pittsburgh guy from earlier in the video. That awesome shootout that Ken O'Brien won. The one guy who needs no introduction and needs no speech about how good he was. All I need is 1 clip and 1 name. Dan Marino.
Inside the 10, has a first down. Ingram again, stopped by Glenn.
Marino's trying to get everybody on the line of scrimmage. Now he still has 1 timeout. They'll save that for the field goal if they have to.
We are seeing another spectacular effort by Marino, who fires. Touchdown!
You know what the Jets were thinking? He's going to take the ball and throw it into the ground.
They stopped.
They all stopped. This is a beautiful play.